They support all our webinars. And then, as Tom was saying, Gore Place, founded in 1935. All right, and so we'll get right into it. So the environment is constantly changing, but the reason I chose to start 400 years ago is because that's around the time that Europeans first made their permanent settlements in what we now call Massachusetts. And European colonization has had significant ecological implications for our region. And when I say our region, I'm mostly talking about the greater Boston area, although we'll talk a bit about New England in general and, some sort of Western Central Mass, but I try to keep it localized. So the Europeans, when they first came about 400 years ago, they came to what was, as you see on this map here, there was a confederation of a whole bunch of different Native American tribes. And the name for Massachusetts comes from the Massachusetts, who their name comes from the what we call Great Blue Hill. So they called it the Massachusetts, which means people of the hill. And so I'll talk a bit about the Massachusetts and the Nipmuc, and sort of how they interacted with their landscape and what their landscape looked like. So humans first came to New England about 10,000 years ago. And when Europeans arrived in the late 1500s and early 1600s, the tribes went by the names you see here. So they went by a whole bunch of names over the years, just like anywhere in the world. But when Europeans arrived, they were going by the Massachusetts in this area, the Wampanoag, the Nauset. And so in central and western Massachusetts, especially farther inland, the landscape would have resembled something like you see on the right. Even coastal areas might have looked like this. So this is called an old growth forest. An old growth forest is not impacted by humans. It hasn't been cut down before. It's just sort of on its own. It's growing. Trees are dying. They fall. They rot into the ground, and then more trees grow. And the only disturbances to this landscape would have been storms, insects, disease, fire from lightning. And while some ecologists suggested that these early indigenous tribes were using fire, controlled burning to control and change these landscapes, more recent research has shown that they probably weren't using a lot of burning. So really the only things that were impacting this old growth environment were the natives who were clearing it, not a whole lot, but cutting it down to make it a little more hospitable, a little easier for them to hunt. But for the most part, they're living along coasts and rivers because they rely a lot on fish and sort of foraging in those areas. And it's not until about 1,000 years ago, so not too long before the Europeans arrived, that they start practicing horticulture. So for thousands of years, various tribes hunted and gathered in this region. Then about 1,000 years ago, they start practicing horticulture, and they live semi-nomadically. So this is, these aren't the farms that the English are gonna set up. This is much more loose, a much more fluid type of horticulture where they're sort of moving from place to place, changing each year. And as many of you might know, they used what's called the Three Sisters method. So the Three Sisters method is when you grow corn with squash and pole beans. And this graphic is pretty helpful here. It shows how the whole thing works. So basically, beans, any legume, they're nitrogen fixing, which means they bring nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil, which is good for the soil. It makes it more fertile. Meanwhile, the beans can wrap around the corn stalk, and then the squash, which has really prickly leaves, protects the whole thing from predators. And so what you get at the end of the day is this really, really nice symbiotic system where you have beans, you have corn, you have squash, and they're all sort of complementing each other. And this is called companion planting today, and it's still commonly used. And the Native Americans are they're credited with starting this, or the first ones to do this. And the English, when they came, learned from this as well. So like I said, they lived on rivers and coasts, and hunted inland. These coastal tribes, like the Wampanoag or the Nauset, they relied a lot on marine resources. So these were a really high percentage of the diet. And water was important for inland tribes as well. And this was also true for the English when they came. So it's no coincidence that the early settlements from the English were along coasts and rivers. So humans tend to gravitate towards water sources. And in the case of many early settlements like Plymouth and Boston, the land was also actively used and maintained by tribes like the Massachusetts and Wampanoag. So these aren't, it's not exactly a wilderness. Still, it was largely forested, and while it was far from an uninhabited wilderness, the forest here was much older and much larger than anything the colonists would have seen before. So, you read literature from that period, and the way that the colonists talk about it, you'd think that they were entering this, complete wilderness that no one's ever used, this pristine wilderness, which of course is not true. But you have to remember where they're coming from. England, the country they left, was almost entirely devoid of trees. So this is mostly cleared. It had been cleared for a long time for agriculture. So when the colonists came here, they saw these old growth forests that, granted, were being used, but the trees are much older, much bigger than anything they've seen. So naturally, they think, "Wow, this is a wilderness." So in the early 17th century, that the fact that it's a wilderness, which is sort of exciting at first because they have lots of resources that are untapped, it starts to become an obstacle because the English like to farm. So the English, they practice what's called mixed husbandry. And so unlike the Native Americans who are practicing horticulture, which is just the raising of crops, the English practice agriculture, which is raising animals and crops together. And mixed husbandry is a distinctly British tradition, and it's manure and hay are at the heart of this. So you use manure from your animals, you throw them out in the field, helps fertilize the field. Then you need the hay to feed the animals, and then all that requires a ton of space. But it is an integrated system, so everything is complementing one another. So you have the animals who feed on the hay, create the manure, which fertilizes the soil, which helps grow your crops. So it's an integrated system, mixed husbandry, and it's also very communal. So when the English come here, as you see on the right here, this is the Plymouth plantation. They shared the commons and they built their houses close together. So they had what's called an infield outfield system. So they had these really big fields where they would share them. Their animals would pasture in the same place, and they would grow crops in similar areas, and then they would divide up their wood lots. So it wasn't like everyone had their own little enclosed property. It was more like this, where you'd have a house next to your neighbors. You're all close together, which was safer. If there's an attack, and then they would share their land, which was divided between parcels all around the area. So it wasn't just one enclosed property quite yet. All right. So, like I said, this mixed husbandry, it requires a lot of space. So unlike the Native Americans, which they were able to hunt and sort of alter their environment with minimal, I guess, their impact compared to the English is minimal. So of course they're hunting and they do have an impact on the land. They weren't like like nowadays people think about the Native Americans as like these ecological people who sort of knew the land, and it's sort of like a caricature of what they really were. I think it's not totally accurate because they're humans, and their impact on the environment is similar to ours, although the difference between the English and the native land practices is that the English was much more expansive. So the English create a world of fields and fences. And so here's a picture here of a very bucolic pastoral landscape. And so, of course, they need to chop down a lot of trees. And this was really difficult at first because these trees are really old. These are old growth forests. These trees are 300, 400 years old. But the good thing is they're really sturdy. So, they're able to build tons of fences, and they're also able to build these stone walls. So we'll talk about that a bit later. But here is a picture from the Harvard forest dioramas. So that first picture, I'll go back to it. This is also from the Harvard forest dioramas. And these were created in the mid 20th century to help show sort of the process of environmental change in New England. And it's definitely a generalization. So obviously not everywhere in New England looked like this, but I'm going to use these as sort of a guide for us to sort of see how the average farm or how the landscape generally is tending to change. Although I don't think these dioramas perfectly capture the entire process, but they are a good resource. So here's a picture of an early family farm. So this would be mid to late 18th century. This is not too long after the English have arrived. So this is still a really forested landscape, although you see they've cleared some land. They've built a stone wall. They have some animals too. So over time, things, the economy growing as it does, the English are much more concerned with private property and with, oh, sorry, I'm getting, oh, oops. I'm making can I make the, I will try to make the pictures full screen. I'm not sure if I can do that. Sorry about that. Oh, no. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can make these pictures full screen. I could zoom in on them. But okay, sorry about that. So go back a second. So this is mid to late 18th century, and farmers at this point are mostly self-provisioning. They're mostly providing for themselves. They're practicing mixed husbandry. They're raising their animals. They're raising their crops. They're sort of doing everything on their own, but they're also involved with the market. So if they need certain things, they can always get it from a neighbor or from someone traveling with certain goods. It's not every man for himself, although people are much more self-reliant than they are now. That these people provided most of what they needed for themselves.